Alright everyone, so welcome back to another video. Now this will be part 3 in the series and will also be the final part. And in this video we will be taking a look at the game over state. We will also add some sprites to the player, the bubble and the arrow. And we will also add some finishing touches and work on the UI a little bit. So the first thing we want to do is inside of our game manager script, we want to make a signal for the lives updated, and this will be used to actually detect, or I mean emit the signal once the player has been damaged, and that way we can go ahead and update the lives that we will have set up in the UI, and as well to detect the game over state. And we will also be adding some typing here so that it knows, so that Godot knows what to check and doesn't have to do all sorts of other things. So we add a variable called gameActive, which will basically keep track of the game during the playing. And in the reset game, we want to make sure we initialize the variables we have just created, so that every time reset game is called, we can simply just assume that the variables will have been initialized properly. And then we also want to emit the lives updated signal, because we need to make sure we start with 3 lives when we start the game or reset the game. What we then want to do is actually go ahead and make a function to lose some lives. In here we'll just simply go ahead and deduct 1 life every time it's called. And then we want to emit the lives updated signal as well. Then what you want to do is you want to check if the lives is less than or equal to 0. And then if it is, we want to set the game to be false so that it isn't active anymore. And then we want to emit the signal that the game is over so that we can use that later on in our main script. Then what we are doing right here is we want to make sure that if the game isn't active, we simply don't allow the bubbles to pop, and we just don't allow the player to shoot. And that way we know for a fact that the game will not be frozen, but nothing will happen when we actually do some actions. So then now we want to change our player script to basically handle these game over state, and we also want to make sure that the lives will actually be called, and that way we need to actually connect our signal. And by doing that, we first want to loop over the collisions to actually get the bubble, so that we know when we hit a bubble, then the score actually gets updated. So we get the collider, and then we want to check if the collider is going to be in the group of bubbles. And we also define a new variable here called invulnerable, which will basically make the player immune to damage for a short period of time of 2 seconds when actually taking damage by a bubble. So that's what we are doing up there. We just define a new variable which will be a boolean, and we set it to false by default. So then in this if statement, we want to make sure we add a new function, which is going to be named hit by bubble, which will detect if we were hit by a bubble, right? So what this does is it simply goes ahead and sets the invulnerability to be false, or true, I mean, and it will start a new timer. And we also want to make sure that the player takes damage, and that is why we made the lose life function inside of the game manager. So then if the game manager lives is greater than 0, we want to make sure to set the player to become invulnerable. And this is another function we will be making right here, which simply sets it to true. And then after 2 seconds, we just go back to its previous state. So over here you can see that we also changed the opacity of the player, which is the modulate.a, which will set it to a half, which basically means that the player just becomes a little bit more transparent so that we know we have an indicator that we actually got damaged. Now you could also add something like a red border around the player. That's something you could do yourself. Shouldn't be too hard. So there will be another thing you could do. And then we connect the timer to a function that we will call right here, which is the onInvulnerability timeout, which simply just sets the invulnerability to false again, so that we are able to get hit again. And we also want to make sure we set the opacity back to 1, so that the player isn't semi-transparent and is just fully visible. So then now we want to come over to our main script, in which we will start working on the UI for a little bit. Now we start up by calling a setup UI function, which is something we'll create, which basically just initializes the UI. And this will also go ahead and hold the score label, a game over label, and we will also add a lives label. We also make sure we add the lives update signal onto our main script right here and connect it to a function that is called onLivesUpdated, which will basically just update the label when we actually take damage by a bubble. Then what we're going to do is make the setup UI function, which will pretty much just go ahead and, as I've said before, update the score, and it will also go ahead and update the lives, which we have already set up in the previous video. So then we want to go ahead and actually make these elements. So we want to start by creating a control node, which we'll just rename to UI. And then we want to add 3 different labels, which will be the lives label, the score label, and then lastly the game over label. Now for the lives label, we want to go ahead and align it top left in the top here with the anchor preset. And then we just want to add a little bit of an offset, which you can find under layout and then over a transform. You can go ahead and set the position to be 20 and on the X and 20 on the Y value. And then we just want to add a little bit of a text there to initially say lives 3, because we start with 3 lives. Then for the score label, we also want to align it top left, and we want to set the text to be score 0, so that we have a little bit of text at the beginning. And we want to set the position to be 20 on the X value and 50 on the Y value. So that way it is just below the lives label. Then for the game over label, we can pretty much just set it in the center on the anchor position, and we want to set the text to be game over. And then also we want to make sure that we align it in the center for both the horizontal and vertical alignment. Now you can see me playing around here with the anchor presets, but that's actually not needed. We'll just be setting it in the middle later on, just manually. We can also add a little bit of a text color. So we'll set the font size to 64 to actually set it to a big size that the player can see. And we also want to make sure that under colors, we make the text red to indicate that we have lost, unfortunately. Then we want to make sure that the game over text is visible by default, and we can do so by coming over to the bottom under visibility. You want to set visible to false, or off, so you basically uncheck the box. And then we can go back to our code here. So we want to make sure we reference all 3 labels inside of our code. So you simply hold Control while you release mouse 1 in the file, and that way you instantly have a reference to the label with the correct file path. Then inside of our onScore_updated, which we have made in the previous video, we simply want to set the label of the score to be the new score. So we do so by doing this. Then we also make the same function, but for the lives updated, which is the exact same, only just using different variables. So we make sure we change the lives label text instead of the score label, and we want to make sure that the parameter will be the amount of lives that we have left. Then inside of our game over function, we want to make sure we set the game over label to be visible for the player. And then we also want to start a little bit of a timer to actually go ahead and restart the game automatically after 3 seconds. So we do so by creating the timer and then connecting the timeout to be a function to call the reset game inside of our game manager file. So this way, after 3 seconds, the reset game function gets called and we just restart the game if the game was over to begin with. So now as we can see, we go ahead and take damage here by the bubble and the lives actually go down. Now in here we can also see a bug that when we shoot the game over text appears, which is due to the bubbles remaining. We don't really set up the score properly, or we don't keep track of the bubbles properly. So this is something we'll have to fix. So we can actually get rid of the start level function because we no longer use that. And we can just simply call the reset game instead. So let's get rid of that in the game over or in the game manager. Yeah, because we don't use it anywhere else. That's fine. So then to fix the actual error inside of the console here, we want to make sure that every time we call setup bubble size, we wrap it around a call deferred so that it goes ahead and gets called after a little bit of a delay so that the monitoring state is just changed a little bit later and not instantly. So we do the same with the collision shape 2D. We want to make sure we call the set shape with the shape we have set up in the previous video. And then also do the same for the spawn smaller bubbles. We also want to make sure that is deferred because that also caused some issues later on. So we fix it already. Alright, so the way we actually fix the game over issue is by registering the bubbles and also unregistering the bubbles. So one way or the way I fixed it is in the bubble script. I went ahead and made a simple register bubble function, or actually called it. And then in the game manager, we actually set it up. So as you can see, we have a deregister bubble, which basically gets rid of one bubble. And then also if there's less than 0 or 0 bubbles, the game over function will be called. And for the register bubble, we simply just add one to the bubbles remaining. Then inside of a func called onBodyEntered, we make sure we check if the body was in group of arrows, and then we simply split the bubble. Then inside of the split, we have the usual code we had, but we also want to make sure we deregister the bubble that is inside of the game manager. And then in the spawn smaller bubbles, we also want to make sure we register the 2 new bubbles that are being created when we actually go ahead and pop a bubble because it splits, right? So we want to make sure that gets added twice as well. Alright, so then we'll add the arrow sprite, which will just go in here. So we go towards the sprite, we add it, then we want to make sure we rotate it by -90 degrees. And we set the size of this, and we also want to make sure that in project settings, we want to set the default texture filter to nearest, so that R2D actually works. Alright, so then for the player, we want to go over to the script as well. For the sprite, we'll add this. Let's increase his size a little bit. And make sure we modify the collision shape to match him fairly well. Alright, so that was it for the tutorial. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. And I'll see you with the next video in a week. Bye bye.